Hey guys, my name is Mitch. This is Nice Art Prints. Let's talk about rendering intent, because I know that's what's been on your mind, huh? It's gonna be fun. Look, I printed off all these little charts and test prints. It is gonna be fun, actually. In the last video, we talked about black point compensation. And when I went into Canon's professional print layout, went down to the bottom, right above the black point compensation little check mark box, you might have noticed something called rendering intent. And if you click on there, you see there are two options, perceptual and relative colorimetric. What does that mean? What is this thing? What does it do? That's what we're talking about. But first, I want to thank the two photographers, that's right, two photographers who sent in images for this video. We got this beautiful image here sent in by Phan. Thank you, Andrew. This was shot on Portra 400. I love the kind of like mellow retro vibes that it has. And then we also have this beautiful image. It's very like Todd Hido meets Gregory Crewdson. This one was sent in by Scotton. Both just great images. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Kevin. For you who's watching, head down to the description. Both of their Instagrams are there. You can and you should follow them. And while you're there, you know what I'm gonna say. Please like and subscribe. These videos take a substantial amount of time between writing a script and shooting it and editing it, printing off all of these files. And because my internet is the slowest in the world, thank you, Spectrum, it takes like 8 hours to upload a video. And since I have nothing better to do, I just, stare at the computer screen while it uploads. So that takes a lot of time. But seriously, thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing it. I can't believe there are 1,000 of us that like to talk about printing. That's pretty cool. That's enough of that. Let's go. Okay, so in order to understand rendering intent, we have to talk about color space. This video is not a full video on color space. That will have to be a whole nother video. But you have to understand the basics. This is a visual representation of all the colors that the human eye can see. This print is not literally all of the colors that the human eye can see because the printer cannot print all of them. In fact, your monitor cannot show all the colors that we can see. Your phone screen cannot show all the colors that we can see. Most devices, probably all devices with the exceptions of like few very specialized, impossibly expensive scientific equipment, cannot produce all the colors we can see. So with that out of the way, this is just a visual representation. But it's going to help us understand color space and then understand rendering intent. What color do I want to use for this one? Let's go with pink. All right. Now, this is not, perfectly accurate because I'm drawing with a Sharpie over top of this, but you'll get the idea. This little triangle and all the colors inside of the triangle are color space. This represents the sRGB color space. The S stands for standard. It was made by HP and Microsoft in the 90s as a way to standardize color across different monitors and printers, and it's still the most standard color space used today. Internet browsers use sRGB. Most apps use sRGB. Apple is pushing for a different color space called P3, but that's a story for another day. Most everything you see on the web is this. It all fits within this little triangle. Green. This shape represents what my printer can print on Hahnemühle Photorag Baryta paper. As you can see, it's bigger than the sRGB color space. One of the nice things about this is anytime I get a picture from somebody that's in sRGB, I know that my printer can print it because it fits neatly inside of it. But what happens when you have a bigger color space? Orange. Okay, these are pretty off, but for purposes of illustrating, this is gonna work. Let's move it down a little bit. This orange represents the Adobe RGB color space. Let me write all these out. Okay, this orange is Adobe RGB. Green is my printer, the Pro 4000, and this pink, purple, violet is sRGB. Okay, so as you can see with Adobe RGB, most of it is contained inside the printer's color space as well. But some of it, these greens up here, and there's some other areas because this is just me drawing by hand, they're outside of the color space. When there are colors that are outside the color space, that's called out of gamut. So let's draw some out of gamut colors, shall we? We'll use blue for this. So let's say you have an image, and that image has like a red, it has some orange, a little bit of blue, it's got some of these greens, but then there's also like, forget about that because we're not talking about that right now. You know, some of these colors are outside of the printer's color space. Well, what are you gonna do? If you were to print this with these colors up here that are outside of the printer's color space, it just wouldn't work. The printer wouldn't know what to do with it. It'd be like, what is this color? As far as the printer is aware, colors outside of there, like they just don't exist. The printer's like, what do you want me to do with it? You have to tell it what to do with it. You basically have to say like, hey, I know this color, like you don't think it exists, but like, let's just move it down here. And what I just did there, by moving that color into the printer's color space, that is relative colorimetric conversion. What relative colorimetric conversion does is it says, hey, any colors like this one that are outside of your color space, just nudge them in. This color conversion is really helpful when these other colors are important. So let's say you're working on a fashion catalog, right? And this like red down here is really important. They've given you the Pantone color that is the exact color of like the sweater in this image. And they're like, don't change that red. Relative colorimetric is good because it only changes what's outside of the printer's gamut. All right. It's like a treasure map with the X. I'm gonna add a little dotted line and a midpoint here. This midpoint of this visualization just represents like pure white at 5,000 Kelvin. The industry standard for printing is like D50, which stands for 5,000 Kelvin. Anyways, all you need to know is like that's white and that's the technical middle of this visualization. Except it's technically not the middle because I'm drawing it by hand, but you know, whatever, it's the middle. It's the middle. We talked about relative colorimetric. Now let's talk about perceptual. So once again, we've got colors that are inside and that are outside of the gamut. Let's put one over here. I'm just putting this over here for illustration purposes, okay? So when you do a perceptual conversion, the program's gonna say like, okay, these colors are out of gamut. And so I'm gonna move them in to gamut, but I want the relationship of all the points to stay the same. So I'm going to move all the points in a little bit. And the point of this is that the colors you perceive and the relationships between those colors remain the same. So if one color moves, all the colors have to move. That's perceptual. Let's show you some examples now. On the left, this print was made with perceptual rendering intent, and this one on the right was made with relative colorimetric. If we look at it, and we're looking at all the different colors, the blue of the sky looks pretty similar, the red-orange of this building's pretty similar, even the greens in the shrub here are pretty similar. But once I go down here into the foliage, and all these like bushes and greenery, you'll notice in the shadows, we got some differences. The greens here are a lot more saturated, but they're also not as deep. We've got more shadows in the greens here. What's happened is, with the relative colorimetric, it only pulled in the greens of these shadows. If I open up the Photoshop file here, you can see these are really saturated greens. That's like 75% saturation. These greens, they were out of gamut, and they were pulled in gamut. But in converting those greens, the relationship between those greens and the surrounding greens that were in gamut has changed. So on the left, the perceived view of the green stays the same, but on the right, the perception's a little different, but the color accuracy is more accurate. Now this is an sRGB file, so it's kind of the smallest amount of color that we can have in a digital image. It's not actually the smallest, but it's like the bare minimum in today's world. If we up it to a 16-bit Adobe RGB file, like this one, there are still differences in the shadows here between these greens and these shadows, but the difference has narrowed. And that's because the original file had more color information to work with. Take a look at this. This is the image by Kevin. So if we look at the 16-bit Adobe RGB file here on the left, this is the Perceptual color conversion. And on the right, we have the relative colorimetric conversion. You'll notice there's no perceptual change between the two. That's because all of the colors in this file fall inside of the Adobe RGB curve and within the Pro 4000 My Printers curve. And so the difference between the two is negligible. Now, hold up. You may be thinking, okay, so I got it. As long as like all my colors are within the printer's gamut, it doesn't matter what I do. So I'm just going to print everything with sRGB. Well, the truth is that's what a lot of photo labs do. They will request files as sRGB files because it's just easier that way. But also, that's just inaccurate because you can print everything within Adobe RGB and assume that like, as long as I kind of stay away from greens, I'm going to be fine. But these color spaces are not created equally. The Adobe RGB and the sRGB color spaces are additive color spaces. You can tell by the RGB. The Pro 4000's color space is a reflective color space. The most famous reflective color space is CMYK. So this color space here is not the same as the other. So even though it appears that there's overlap in this very simplistic visualization I've done, I've misled you in a way. The conversion that has to happen not only converts colors that are out of gamut into gamut, it also converts colors from RGB colors into, it's not CMYK colors, but for the purposes of this video, into CMYK. If you watched my previous video, how to print bright colors, you'll recall that on monitors and screens, colors are produced when you do additive colors. So when you add two colors together in the additive process, those colors become brighter. When you add two colors in the subtractive process, which is how the printer works, those colors become dimmer. So the more you're mixing colors on a screen, the brighter those colors get until finally they're white. The more you add colors on a printer, the darker those colors get until they're black. So a low-key image like this works out just fine because all these greens are pretty dark greens. And even this blue, it's pretty dark. Those colors can be mixed and created, and because they're low-key, they work really well for print because print colors have a tendency to try to be darker. If this were an image that's full of really vibrant, luminous colors, we would have a whole nother problem, and you would see a drastic difference between perceptual and relative colorimetric, because the conversion process has to do a lot more work to figure out like, okay, this is a really bright red, but I don't really have a bright red, so am I going to make all the colors dimmer, or am I gonna just like move this red? And then you'll see a difference between the two. Maybe I got a little too in the weeds there. You probably clicked on this video and you're like, which one should I use? Should I use perceptual or should I use relative colorimetric? It's actually like pretty simple to tell you which one you should do. I use perceptual 99% of the time. I rarely use relative colorimetric. A lot of you printers out there are probably pulling out your hair, but let me explain why. Relative colorimetric is important for color accurate work that is color that exists in the real physical world. Perceptual is good for color that exists on your monitor or on a screen. In today's world, most photographers are working and editing their pictures on a screen, whether it's your phone screen or your computer's monitor. When you're making decisions on color, hue, and saturation and value, that's all done on your computer monitor. Where perceptual rendering intent shines is convincing you that what you see on the paper is the same as what you see on your monitor. Anytime you print, there's going to be sacrifices. These are two different color processes. Screens are emitting light into your eyes, prints are reflecting light, and so you're never gonna get a 100% accurate one-to-one, this is what I see on my screen, and this is what's on the paper. But perceptual does a good job at tricking your eyes into thinking that this is exactly the same. Relative colorimetric is important again for specific colors. You have a sweater or another piece of clothing that is an exact color in real life, and you need that print to print the exact same color. Perfect example. Or let's say you're taking a picture of a painting. That painting has real colors in the real world, and you spent all this time matching those colors in Photoshop and using a color checker and a spectrometer to ensure that each of those colors were the same, well then yeah, you want relative colorimetric so that the print you make is exactly the same. But if you're just working on your monitor, perceptual is the way to go. That's pretty much it. So again, if you're used to seeing your image on a monitor or a screen and you're editing it in that environment on a screen, use perceptual. If the thing that you're printing exists in real life and that color is important to be 100% accurate, use relative colorimetric. But that, like everything else, is subjective. Really what you want to do, and this is why I make test prints, is you want to make the decision yourself. I don't know which one Andrew's going to prefer. I'm going to send him both and I'm going to ask him which one he prefers. It's really up to the artist at the end of the day what you're making, at least in fine art printing, like what I'm doing here and what we're talking about. Anyways, that's just like dipping our toe into color. Color is such a big subject to talk about. All right, I'm going to cut myself off there with one last tip before we close this video out. So, not all of you print with Canon, and not all of you print at all. No matter what, you're going to eventually run into a time when you need to know the difference between perceptual and relative colorimetric. For example, if you're converting colors in Photoshop. Let me show you this. Okay, so here in Photoshop, I've got this image by Kevin. If I go up to the menu and click Edit, and then go down here to Convert to Profile. Pops up this little sub menu. It says my profile source is Adobe RGB, my destination source is sRGB, and look here, conversion intent, relative colorimetric. If I click on that, there's also perceptual, saturation, and absolute colorimetric. Look, there's even a black point compensation checkbox. Those two options actually come from the same family as relative colorimetric. Saturation, as the name implies, focuses on preserving the saturation of the original colors. Absolute colorimetric just moves everything absolutely. It doesn't mess with the white point. So for example, if you were to use absolute colorimetric on a paper that has a yellow tint, all your whites are going to have a yellow tint. If you use relative colorimetric, it's going to try to compensate for that yellow, kind of like doing an auto white balance in your camera. Anyway, hope that helps. So that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to all of you that have liked and subscribed and shared this with other people. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, these videos take a lot of time to make, but I do enjoy making them. A weird side effect of all of this is because now I'm getting so many comments and emails and messages both on YouTube and Instagram, I no longer have time to reply to all of them. So I apologize if I haven't replied to your comment or your question. I think the sad fact is I'm not going to have time to reply to all of them. Likewise, I have to close down image submissions for now. I just have too many images to work through before I'll be able to print them all in these videos. The print shop is still open. I am still printing. That is taking the majority of my time and will continue to take the majority of my time because that's, at the end of the day, that's what I do, is I print pictures for people. So if you would like me to print one of your images, honestly, the best way right now is to order something with the shop. I'm considering doing something like consulting hours. I got to figure out how I would fit that into my schedule. Those are all great problems to have, honestly. Thank you again to all of you for just talking about printing. How great is that? I hope you're all staying safe. I hope your families are safe. I got a lot more videos on color coming down the pipeline because color is such a big subject. We didn't even talk about like bit depth, or there's lots of other color profiles to talk about, like Pro Photo RGB, my least favorite color profile in the world. And on that note, I'll say goodbye. Bye.